Record. All right, cool. Yeah, my wife wants to go to church, so we're doing this a bit earlier, but I couldn't miss our conversation because this is my church.
Mm. Yeah, happy to spend my Sunday morning with you.
I was hoping to start by talking about what it might mean to think and philosophize more like a vegetable, um, beyond simply sitting passively on our couches. Uh, I I am into the epilogue of Crossing the Threshold now, and in the last chapter, um, you say thinking with etheric imagination is thinking with a plant soul. Plant souls, according to Martyr, partake of a quote kind of primordial generosity that gives itself to all other creatures, animates them with this gift, allows them to surge into being, to be what they are. Um, and earlier, something you'd said, it made a lot of sense to me that the world, the planet is much more clearly analogous to a plant than a machine. And it struck me that that's a very rarely pointed out, but seemingly obvious idea. But yeah, so what can you go a little more into that? A plant soul thinking in a vegetable like manner, what that means?
Mm. This idea came to me reading David Hume's two dialogues on natural religion, or yeah, dialogues on natural religion, and he explores different analogies for the universe in that text, including that the universe is an animal, which seems unlikely since animals have sense organs and move around, and the universe as a whole, those movement and the need for sense organs don't really apply because everything's inside the universe. There's nothing outside the universe for it to move through or sense, and so this one of the other dialogue partners suggests, or Hume has them suggest, that well, maybe the universe is more like a plant, and imagines galaxies and star systems forming as sort of seeds spread through the cosmos and take root, and so I started thinking about that, and I think Hume meant it in jest, but I wanted to take it seriously. And you mentioned Michael Martyr, contemporary philosopher who's written three or four books now exploring what he calls vegetal metaphysics or vegetal philosophy. And he, in some of these books, looks at the history of philosophy in the West and the way that plants have been somewhat mistreated by philosophers, going back to Aristotle. Plants were, from Aristotle's point of view, like barely,
Seemingly alive, right? They only seem to be alive.
yeah, because the sort of the prototype of life is the animal that moves around, and again has like sensory experience, but plants are clearly living, and I think as a challenge to our a challenge to the human being's more egocentric way of imagining what it is to sense and live and be conscious. I think really trying to become capable of a sympathy for plant life, and to live into the way in which plants are able to stay rooted where they are and so naturally just praise the light while at the same time growing into the darkness, right? And so there's this particularly balanced movement that it turns out, if we can observe it at the right time speed, as it were, that there's plenty of animation in the plant world. It's just slower than we're used to as animals rushing around trying to get our next meal. And I think there's a certain kind of sensitivity and rootedness, literally and metaphorically, to plant life that provides a whole suite of lessons for human beings who we're so driven to get what we think we don't have already. And there's something about the nature of plant life that, yeah, is so generous. And if you there's something symbolic, I think, about the way in which like animal blood is red, and that symbolizes this passion. And plants are green. Sometimes they have sap, and it's white or other colors. But there's something about this green color that I think expresses this generosity and this attunement to the polar forces that compose our cosmos of, light, or the sun and fire, and earth, darkness, the soil. And plants just beautifully bridge that polarity. Whereas I think animals and the animal nature of human beings, obviously we gain these new capacities. We have faster metabolisms and we can do all this neat stuff, but we can get distracted from what what our cosmic situation really is. And I think plants help remind us of that. And the last thing I'll say is that there's this great passage in Plato's Timaeus, in his cosmological dialogue, where he says that the human being is an inverted plant. And this is particularly true if you think of a tree. Trees have roots in the ground and their branches grow out in in the air, and they reach towards, again, the sun, while also rooting themselves down into the soil. And the human is inverted in the sense that our roots are, our brains, right? And our brains, for Plato, our heads are a microcosmic mirror image of the celestial sphere, and our roots reach out into the sky. And there's something about this vertical orientation that makes human beings somewhat unique among animals. And
but not
most animals are
playful.
horizontal,
Right.
and it makes us like plants.
Mm.
And so, yeah, there's a lot there, a lot more there. It's both a rich metaphor for thinking about thinking and what it might mean to develop a kind of plant thinking.
Mhm.
But it's also more than a metaphor. I think, Aristotle did admit that we have a plant soul in us. We also have an animal soul in us, and then we have this other thing, the thinking soul, the rational soul. And I think if we're able to drop back down into that plant soul, we can feel more rooted in the earth, more at home here, and less like there's somewhere else we might get to that would make us happier. It's just, what does it mean to just be rooted, right? And to let the world come to you.
Yeah, well, you brought up that term in media res, always in the middle of things. Martyr's plant thinking approaches a logic of imagination in that he aims to begin his vegetal philosophizing not from the putatively purified perspective of disembodied rationality, but in media res, always in the middle of things. And then this is a quote from him: to live and to think in and from the middle, like a plant partaking of light and of darkness, is to refashion oneself, one's thought, and one's existence into a bridge between divergent elements, to become a place where the sky communes with the earth and light encounters but does not dispel darkness. That sounds important, that it encounters but does not dispel darkness. And then you go on to say, only by finding its vegetal roots can philosophy become planetary, true to the earth and to the plant like etheric forces of imagination. But because the etheric imagination is in fact abyssal / ungrounded, its plant like growth must be inverted. It has underground stems and aerial roots, as you just explained. As Deleuze and Guattari put it, or as Gaston Bachelard, I might be mispronouncing that,
Close
suggests,
enough.
okay, echoing Plato, the properly rooted philosopher is like a tree growing upside down, whose roots, like a delicate foliage, tremble in the subterranean winds while its branches take root firmly in the blue sky. For Bachelard, the plant is the root image of all life. Quote, the imagination must take possession of all the powers of plant life, he writes. It lives between earth and sky. It becomes imperceptibly the cosmological tree, the tree which epitomizes a universe, which makes a universe. Hmm. Yeah, a lot of people don't have their first close encounter with the plant world until they take mushrooms or something and
Mm.
suddenly have the first yeah, sense that it's alive even, and where it starts, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I don't dwell too much on the psychedelic application of this plant thinking, but that's certainly true. Plants and fungi. I mean, fungi are actually a little bit closer to animals than plants genetically, which is kind of a trip.
How could that be true given the way they show up?
I mean, the mushroom that we see is only the fruiting body of the organism, which is in the form of mycelium mostly, right? That's these huge underground networks only pop up as mushrooms here and there to reproduce themselves, and mycelium is quite apparently intelligent and cognitive in its capacity to navigate environments and to communicate across vast distances. And so, and then, as someone who may have dabbled in growing mushrooms in my closet in college, they pop up really fast. You know, there's something quite phallic about it, but it's like overnight, all of a sudden, this giant mushroom appears. And so they move much faster than plants in terms of the rate of growth. But yeah, something like ayahuasca, I think makes it quite obvious that there is a deep, ancient intelligence in in plants that we just don't usually have the facilities, the faculties rather, to notice, but drinking ayahuasca brings it inside of you. And then of all of the psychedelic plants and fungi, ayahuasca seems the most like inhabited by a plant spirit, right? And then, so it becomes very impossible to ignore that plant intelligence when you've ingested it.
Yeah, yeah. And it's easy for many people to think that's just the means of inviting that spirit that has nothing to do with the plant itself. But I guess a more in media res way to view it would be, no, this is an encounter with this plant that you've ingested. There's a reason this is the means of inducing the experience.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, there's a lot in your book about creativity as the primordial kind of first category, and then descriptions of philosophers like Whitehead and Schelling and Deleuze as those philosophers who were willing to dive, I think you said, heart first into those depths and then seek to bring something back. And this notion of imagination is a little tricky at points because you know that the normal way somebody's going to think of imagination are these pictures that pop up in the mind. And those pictures that pop up in the mind, of course, have a role in this process of imaginative cosmogenesis. But then there are quotes from guys like William Blake saying, the man of imagination, to the man of imagination, nature is imagination itself. And when I think about this sort of inverted thought process, um, and this sense that, when you're taking a walk through the woods and thinking, in some sense, you're also walking through your imagination in the form of the woods, but at a later stage in the process where it has become real, um, rather than the notion that you're walking through this thing that simply exists of its own accord and you're extracting impressions from it that then you get to ponder over and maybe try to force some of your notions out upon it. Um, but this idea that the nature we are beholding in the physical world is also imagination in some sense. That I would imagine for most people first encountering an idea like that would be very counterintuitive. I feel I can get in tune with that way of thinking, but I'd love to hear you elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, we're so used to thinking that the world is something we have to represent inside our brains, and that we have these five senses that are like the windows onto some, material external world that exists independent of our observation of it. And, that's our materialistic common sense nowadays. But, I think people can understand, maybe as an entryway into this idea of a kind of cosmic imagination, that, we have a worldview, and each culture has a worldview. And, materialism and this idea that consciousness is in the head is a rather, historically, it's rather new. And still today is, while it's dominant, say, in the global north and in industrialized, some most industrialized civilizations, societies, it's actually still quite marginal. And, most people find it incredible, unbelievable that consciousness should just be something inside the head, and that there's just a inert, persisting material world out there that we're just trying to accurately as we can represent inside our heads. And I'm trying to speak to, you know people who are predominantly Western industrial, post-industrial peoples who take that as their common sense about an alternative possibility. And there have always been streams of poetic thought and philosophy in the West that have tried to you know argue for and perform even this view, like Blake, the whole romantic tradition, that actually imagination is not just a faculty that we have for forming pictures in our heads, but it's more like a place that we inhabit. And we ourselves are products of imagination. And, you know, the human imagination is just a microcosmic repetition of the divine or cosmic imagination. And it's a figure ground shift. It's a kind of topological inversion where, you can start to question, even just scientifically initially, the model we have of consciousness being like, as Dan Dennett would say, a Cartesian theater in the skull somewhere. There's no redness in the head. There's just neurons firing. There's no the smell of a rose. Like you're not going to find that in your head anywhere. The feel of velvet, the melody that the birds are chirping, like all of these things, they're actually in the world, right? And our consciousness is actually extended into the ecosystem around us, right? And so this is an invitation to think of our bodies as just to take it in phenomenologically. It's an image. Our bodies are an image. The world around us is a network of images. And yeah, scientifically we study the causal relationships among these images, but our most immediate experience of the world is as a network of images. And it takes quite a bit of hand waving and like abstract imposition upon experience in order to contort it into this, idea we have of somehow consciousness all being inside the brain or inside the skull. If we just attend to our experience, there's images, there's sounds, there's emotions, so imagination in English makes it seem like it's just about imagery, but it's all the senses. It's synesthetic, and and so it's just an invitation to look again and hear again and feel again at what's most immediate in our experience, and from there to reimagine the world and reimagine our own consciousness as participants in this. I use the term abyssal or groundless, to prevent us from feeling like there has to be a hidden cause somewhere, like whether it's in the head or it's at the atomic scale of matter or something. What if we don't reach for some causal mechanism behind the scenes, but we just stay with what's on stage? And yet maybe there is a backstage, and maybe we could talk about that. But just stay with what's actually experienced,
Mm.
right? And that experiential reality is a place that we exist within that I would call imagination.
So for you, Daniel Dennett's dismissal of the Cartesian theater isn't a flippant throwing out of something really important. He's actually engaging in the similar project of reorienting the mind toward the real in that scenario.
Dan Dennett is very close to, he ends up very close to a kind of pan-experientialism. And I'm not the only one who thinks that, but it's a subtle shift that occurs. I mean, he's influenced by these philosophers from the mid 20th century, like Gilbert Ryle and Ludwig Wittgenstein, who thought of philosophy and metaphysics as a kind of like these metaphysical problems, like the mind body problem. It's like a knot in our metaphysical musculature that needs to be massaged out, and we kind of need to unask a lot of these questions that get us all perplexed. And so I think Dennett wants to show us out of, this is Wittgenstein's metaphor, out of the fly bottle, like show the fly out of the bottle so that we stop feeling like we're trapped inside our heads. And so his view is sometimes called eliminative materialism, in the sense that he doesn't think that there is such a thing as consciousness, that we're one day going to figure out, like figure out how the brain produces it in the skull. He's like, no, there's no such thing as that. And I agree with him. We're never going to ask the question, how does the brain produce consciousness, is just a bad question. But rather than eliminate it, I want to, I'm a more of a pan-experientialist. Like, no, it's everywhere. It's not in the head. It's everywhere. We're inside of it. And it's like quite a subtle difference, whether you go in the eliminative materialist direction or the panpsychist, pan-experiential direction. They end up almost, I mean, they use a lot of the same moves to get there. It's just, I think it's a matter of, whether one, like Dennett, has more of a desire to explain away something that's precious to a certain kind of mystical mentality, or someone who's like, well, maybe life is mystical and mysterious, and that's okay. We don't need to explain it away. We can just be with it.
Yeah. So something that confuses me a little bit about the idea of the ether and the etheric imagination that connects to what we're talking about now, this sense that we're inside of consciousness and it's everywhere. And yet we are isolating this idea of the ether as something that's also inside of this matrix of consciousness, as a particular feature of it like that element that is within ourselves, that is also out there, that allows us to commune with it, resonates, but then it seems to make all this room for these other categories of non-connected parts of ourself, because we have to hone in on the ether and cultivate our etheric imagination. um is the ether something separate, or is it a way of understanding everything? Is everything the ether?
Etheric imagination is a an organ of perception as well as a encompassing medium. And it's as an organ of perception, it's an attempt to think beyond binaries, to think beyond separative categories. And I mean, ether just signals like the betweenness, the matrix, the connective tissue of the world, which you can't really see with your physical senses. You can't draw a circle around it and say there it is, because it's the very yeah, matrix through which we perceive anything at all, right? And so it's a very slippery concept, and no doubt, you know, I wrote a book about it in an effort to conceptually describe, articulate it, and so on. But it's not a concept. It's a felt experience, and it's it's the condition that, you know, Kant talks about the conditions of the possibility of knowledge, and I'm trying to go a step deeper than that, or broader than that, by talking about the ether as the condition for or of actual experience. Like, how is it that I can experience myself here and the world over there? What is the conduit by which that communion can occur? And you know, physics for a couple hundred years had its own version of this, the luminiferous ether, which was an attempt to explain how light can travel as a wave, right, through space. If light is a vibration, there must be a medium in which it is vibrating. And you know, in the early 20th century, with Einstein's relativistic revolution, some of the physics community and the way that physics became popularized after Einstein started to tell this story like, oh, well, we don't need the ether anymore. That was an unscientific or pseudo pre-scientific idea, and we've outgrown it now, and now we just have this other kind of math. But Einstein himself said, no, my understanding of the space-time manifold or field is just a new ether. It's just a subtler form of the luminiferous ether that was so important in the 19th century. And the the sort of ether I'm talking about is even more general than just what physics would refer to, because I'm trying to dissolve any boundary between the physical universe and our psychical existence, our consciousness, right? And so what is the even subtler ether? It's not a material ether, but it's this subtle ether that would actually exist again between what we think of as spirit and matter. It's neither immaterial, but nor is it just some totally intangible spirit. It's what's in between that, right? And so thinking betweenness is could only ever be paradoxical and elliptical, and you know, poetry becomes, and metaphor and analogy becomes the only means we have of getting at that betweenness.
Yeah. So so you could think of ether as the relation between spirit and matter.
Hmm.
The
It's the bridge.
for, if spirit and matter are two sides of one coin, we could call that coin ether.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, the I'm understanding more and more why language can be tricky in these realms, and the phrase like modes of thought seems applicable here, where sometimes you're sending a term. A term is like a message you're sending from one mode of thought to another mode of thought to like beckon toward this other mode. And then once that mode being beckoned toward is successfully achieved, now that term that got us here, ether or imagination or spirit, well, now it's everywhere and now it's everything. So we're here, like, well, wait, where was the thing I was looking for? But it was more like a beckoning messenger. Um,
Yeah, I mean, another analogy for this would be like the ether is like the silence between the words.
mhm,
Very easy not to notice it, but if it wasn't there, we couldn't talk to each other.
right. And the space between the notes, there would be no music.
Hmm.
That's yeah, that's great. Let's see what else I have here. Something else I wrote down. Um, the human being is unique among earthly creatures in that it knows reality's ground is incomprehensible. With this knowledge, we can either use our newfound freedom to flee upwards by way of anti physical idealistic transcendentalism, or we can fall deeper in love with cosmogenesis via a descendental naturalism. The former option, freedom without love, quickly devolves into alienated nihilism. Idealists like Kant and Fichte tried to overcome this devolution by privileging practical over theoretical philosophy. To save the possibility of moral responsibility among humans, they had to deny the possibility of a sympathetic knowledge of nature. That was a line that I didn't fully understand. And I know that, I mean, we've talked about Kant, and his a lot of the acrobatics he ended up doing were in some way connected to his traditional Christian notion of the moral decision making soul that he had to protect. Why? How did the idea come about that if we have a deep sympathetic knowledge of nature, that somehow would rob us of moral responsibility?
So historically, the rise of this Enlightenment conception of freedom was very much predicated upon a mechanistic conception of nature, because the idea is that like human freedom and autonomy had to be won by way of buffering ourselves from this sense of enchantment with nature, where enchantment would mean that like the natural world is singing into us and almost hypnotizing us, and it takes away our autonomy by bewitching us with its animacy, right? And so we become more, the enchanted animistic worldview is one wherein the human soul is in some sense vulnerable to possession by.
Right. Okay, so in that view, sympathetic resonance with nature all the time would mean we're always possessed.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And so we wanted to become the possessors of nature. And so this enlightenment shift, the disenchantment of nature and the mechanization of nature comes right alongside the growing sense of empowerment of the free, rational ego, right? What makes us free and rational is precisely our ability to master and control the natural world. And so, Kant and Fichte are, as Kant says, in his critique of pure reason, he found it necessary to limit our knowledge to leave room for freedom. So to limit our knowledge of nature to this mechanistic appearance, even though he knew that nature couldn't really just be that, he also was totally committed to protecting human freedom. And so knowledge gets limited then to a kind of what's called instrumentalism. It's like knowledge as power, basically. And that becomes the paradigm for modern mechanistic science. And whereas Kant knew that, treating nature as a mechanism was sort of an as if, like, this is just how our rational mind has to operate, and the assumption it has to make in order for us to remain free. In the 19th and 20th century, there was some drift away from that view to actually believing that nature was just a mechanism. And so more and more that defense of freedom that was so important for Kant became less important, to the extent that, you get to someone like Daniel Dennett or other contemporary materialist thinkers for whom we're not actually agents. We're more like sophisticated zombies, basically.
Mm.
Right? This is this eliminate. I know. So strictly speaking, for any Dennett stands out there, yeah, I know he was a compatibilist, which is this attempt to have determinism and freedom coexist, but it's some gymnastics that I think just confuse the issue. There's no room for freedom in a materialistic ontology, right? And so there was this drift away from the emphasis on freedom that you had in these idealist thinkers, and that leads us in some rather dystopian directions. Whereas someone like Schelling, and then later Whitehead, are trying to rediscover a way of coming into sympathetic resonance with the natural world, granting animacy to the non-human world, but in a way that wouldn't just make us completely vulnerable and in a sort of undifferentiated way, but can we see the human being as one particularly potent example of the animacy of nature and even the spirit of nature, so that we can come into a participatory relationship with an ensouled world as a partner, rather than just like going back into the womb and dissolving into the oceanic feeling that Freud was so worried about. And so it's an attempt to recover what was lost, but with a greater degree of differentiation for the human being, where we can step into our role as co-creators rather than just passive recipients of the meaning of the world.
Mhm. Mm. Talking about Dennett makes me think about Jung's book, The Psychological Types, and how he breaks down different people as sensation types or thinking types or feeling types. And, you know, are there seem to be these brilliant minds who might not take full account of the importance of direct feeling in an emotional way, or love even isn't a large enough part of their philosophy. And could it be they aren't feeling much of it, and not because they are missing something vital, but because it's simply a smaller feature of the world as presented to them?
Mm.
And you read Nietzsche, and one of the most brilliant minds you could ever encounter, and there's a lot of Freudian feeling in there that this guy didn't get enough hugs from his mom, and the sense of the mother has this repulsion for him. But uh you're like, well, this guy, he doesn't talk about love or its importance much, even though he says all that happens for love takes place beyond good and evil. But that quote, when you actually read the book, it's not a poem about love.
Mm-hmm.
um and the tendency for someone who is more rooted in love as the form of primary connectedness to the world around them, or is trying to be, is to think, well, these minds are missing something. But should we be making room for all these separate orientations, including brilliant minds for whom feeling and connection to other people isn't as important to them, and they simply are analytically oriented,
Yeah.
and that or or is love so fundamental that these people are missing something that they could have were they properly instructed or open, that would only enhance what they contribute?
Mm. Well, I think Fichte was right about something when he said that the kind of philosophy that one professes depends on the kind of person that one is. And so, and Nietzsche says something like, every work of
Unconscious
philosophy.
autobiography.
Yeah. And so I think for people like Dennett, he seems like a really nice guy. I never met him, but he just would say that, the feelings of love that he would have for family and friends, it's all great and wonderful, but it has nothing to do with the knowledge that we can gain of reality. It's that he would want to put the emotional side of our existence to the side, and try to view the scientific study of the natural world as necessarily impersonal and not tainted or obscured by all of these subjective things.
It's the reception of those feelings as distraction or ultimately irrelevant. There's that video of him talking to Richard Dawkins on the back deck, and they go into how much they appreciate the beauty of nature. But whenever the beauty of human connection comes up, they acknowledge it, but they're always sure to emphasize that this has nothing to do with the pursuit of the true.
Yeah.
No matter how immediately it presents itself, no matter how close to the heart it is, it's some kind of distraction. And yeah, I don't understand it.
Well, it's a religious devotion to the elimination of any kind of anthropomorphism in our conception of what the universe is, right? And so they would just want to put all of that soppy stuff to the side because for them it's just a projection of our human need for connection onto a world that doesn't give a fuck about us, you know?
What about our human need for objective knowledge projected upon a world that is fundamentally not objective? It
Yeah.
just there's just some fundamental devaluing, which makes me think their dials of consciousness much must just be tuned differently. And I try to dial in my own experience. Like what's the data coming in that I sort of filter out as less relevant than the rest, that doesn't present itself to me first and foremost as very important.
Yeah. I mean, there's a certain, I think, form of like way of forming our personalities around being a scientist or being a scientific philosopher that has it's this heroic stance that like I don't need the universe to care about me. I'm strong enough to accept the truth, and that can be a way of making meaning for oneself, making meaning out of life by taking a stance like that. But there is a deep inconsistency in that, which comes through in one of my favorite Whitehead quotes, which I know you've heard that scientists animated by the purpose of proving that they are purposeless constitute an interesting subject for study. And so, like, we can be really cautious about anthropomorphizing the universe, but at the same time, we don't want to push that so far that we forget that the universe did give rise to human beings. The universe is anthropogenic. Like, where did we come from? Why would there be such a sensitive creature capable of such a deep emotion if there weren't some correspondence or some seed of that in the universe, right? And so there's just for me a more integral way of thinking about our human situation and the scientific enterprise itself that wouldn't require this splitting. It really is a splitting and a compartmentalization of our human experience into subjective and objective, or rational and emotional, or whatever, when quite clearly, like, the pursuit of scientific knowledge requires that there be some motivation to pursue that. Why is this valuable, right? And where is that valuation coming from? Where is that motivation coming from? You can't separate science off from these other aspects of human nature as if it's just, we pursue the objective truth because instead of, well, we pursue the truth because we're devoted to its value, and we think that it's meaningful. And so outside the context of value and meaning and motivation, there really would be no science. There could be no science, and we wouldn't even care about truth.
Mhm. I'm gonna actually read from the book here. Um, so you're talking about Schelling, Whitehead, and Deleuze, saying this world-renewing incarnational task is especially difficult in that all three thinkers generated concepts in response to encounters with non-ordinary problematics, which is to say that the solutions distilled by their concepts problematize naive egoic subjectivity by acting as alchemical catalysts that alter not only the contents of conscious thoughts, but the normally taken for granted imaginative background of thought itself. There are a lot of sentences and allusions like that throughout the book, and every time I have this sense that, like, wait, I need to quiet down right now. Like, it's back there. I can find it. There's like some kind of signal to be tuned into. And then also all of these moments where that flips, and it's like, no, the signal is out there. It's right in front of you. It's not in here. And I know this is another version of something we've already discussed in this conversation, but it's one of the fundamental um, paradoxes that I keep wrestling with here. And maybe that's the point, that you're supposed to keep wrestling with that. But I am always dealing with, on one level, the feeling that my own spiritual slash intellectual development, that the frontier of that is in my ability to dive very deep into myself, and pay close attention to themes in my dreams and do a kind of automatic writing, where I just see what comes out naturally, and then study that, and figure out what are the battles going on within me, with this idea that maybe I could reconcile these conflicts and thereby become, a more centered, patient, loving person. Um, and then it flips, and there's the sense that I am trying to magnify some Cartesian theater with only limited reality, when there's this unfolding of immediate events going on between me in front of me at all times. um and uh and that's where I should be orienting my attention primarily. And I'm sure the answer isn't one or the other, but yeah, this undetected plane of immanence, then I'm like, well, okay, if it's undetected, it can't be the thing right in front of me, because I'm detecting that very immediately. um but it's also not just these intrusive thoughts, because these also just present themselves and are very detectable. um
Hmm.
this undetected plane of immanence, take me there.
Well, it's the very feeling of frustration that you're trying to articulate right now. It's like the eye trying to see itself, the ear trying to hear itself. Like, it can't actually do it, but sometimes these interference patterns, or this feedback happens when you're like, oh, that's the very process of perceiving itself trying to twist itself back around upon itself and like tickle itself, but it's like really hard to tickle yourself because you're like, this isn't really working. Like, I need someone else to do it. And so we fall back into that sense of, okay, perceiver over here, perceived over there. But it's consciousness trying to tickle itself, and immanence for Deleuze is something like what I'm getting at with the ether, where it's the always already we're always already permeated by it. We can't get outside of it to see it. We could just be it, but there is this wink that the world provides us that gives us at least an inkling of the pervasive presence of this this field, and the kind of transformation I'm trying to describe in that passage you read is, again, it's not just like a new peak experience, to add to your repertoire, but a very it's the transformation of your sense of self, right? And so it's a reorientation to experience. It's a turning inside out of the shape that you thought the world had, and it's it's quite these words can, like you were saying earlier, evoke these experiences, but they're also just, they can fall flat also, and if you don't have the corresponding itch, or if you've never experienced the paradox of trying to, the paradoxes of self-consciousness, I think what you're describing, this desire to go inward and deeper and deeper and deeper, and find your core essence. You know, Buddha had a lot to say about the impossibility of that, but I don't think it doesn't need to be a search for the substantial self. It can be more just a process of selfing, and that's what the self is. It's an activity, and when we engage it in a meditative and contemplative way, when we do visualization exercises, we're we're expanding our capacity to feel that feedback I was talking about, and to enjoy it rather than it being frustrating. We just see, oh, that's as close as I'm ever going to get,
Mhm.
to actually hearing myself hearing, or seeing myself seeing. Like, that's what it feels like. And when you grasp the ungraspability of that, it yeah, you could, it just leads to this kind of, it's that wink, it's that cosmic chuckle, it's this sense of not having an answer to every question or having the mystery resolved, but feeling at home in the uncanniness of your own existence.
Mhm. I I want to ask you another question. I'm sure most, if not all, of your students would describe you as a patient teacher. You're a patient person, and that might be, to a certain degree, quality you came prepackaged with. I'm sure you've also developed it through the increase in wisdom from your reading and your experience as a teacher. But this quality of patience, in your case, would you describe it as a narrowing down of the kinds of input that can irritate you, or better ability to handle irritation and not show it? Like, do you find yourself in many interactions throughout the day, whether with students or just with people throughout the world, and that are just rubbing you the wrong way and like are painfully irritating, and you wish at every moment you could go back into this world of ideas and be talking with people that are more like-minded? Um, or do you find yourself getting better and better at just taking each person for who they are and seeing their attempt to communicate as interesting in its own way at whatever level or frequency it's on. Is that an ongoing struggle? What's that journey been like for you, and where are you on that path now?
Well, I think if you were to talk to like lovers and people I've been in an intimate relationship with, there's clearly times when I get frustrated and angry, and people we love bring out the best and the worst in us. But I think I think it's just that I've really cultivated a sense of curiosity and about myself and about others, and I know myself well enough to know that I have no idea who I am. And so I don't expect others to be like consistent or to have any more of a sense of who they are than I do, and that we're always discovering each other together. And I need the reflections of others to see myself, and so I don't know. And almost sounds like I'm saying I've got lower expectations for people. So, but that's not really what I mean to say. It's more just, I think, yeah, the curiosity and the joy that I derive from being in dialogue, and being able to teach. I mean, I became a professor because I wanted to be in school forever. I wanted to continue learning forever, and even though I teach, like I've taught my course on German idealism like 5 or 6 times now, and the reason I enjoy it so much is because, you know, every time I teach it, it's a new batch of students who are being exposed to these ideas for the first time, and no two people have the same response to reading Kant or Fichte or Schelling or Hegel. Like everybody has their own reaction to it and a new angle of approach to integrating it and assimilating it to their pre-existing understanding of things. And for me, it's just so exciting to be able to see how that chemical reaction happens. Because yeah, these ideas are like catalysts, but everybody has their own, or their own uniquely shaped molecule coming into contact with this catalyst, and how it reacts, how they react, is always a surprise, right? And so it's refreshing and just keeps me on my toes and allows me to continue to learn about new facets of these ideas that I hadn't considered before. And so I think just staying in that curiosity and giving giving people permission to not know and to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes. For me, it's just a joyous process to witness and partake in. So
Do you, sorry, were you about to say,
no, no, go ahead.
um, do you feel that as life goes on and we age, of course, you think about death much more than the average person, and are largely reconciled with a picture of the universe in which what we most fundamentally are continues. Are you ever surprised by how some very conventional sign of getting a little older, not being um, the the young person with their entire life ahead of them at like 21 or something, something like that shows up and can still like poke you in a way that it is more painful than it would be if you had fully imbibed this peace with the process? Or is that a practice that are you pretty much at peace with aging? I mean, I know we're both fairly early in the process, but all we have to compare ourselves to right now are like teenagers and guys in our 20s, right? And so you're not that anymore. And there's a new way people talk to you, as like, oh, you're supposed to kind of be who you are now. You're not just a bundle of promise anymore. And, you're not, the physical changes aren't just like, oh, look, I look even more like a grown-up version of myself. It's like, oh no, that process has begun over there, and and it's only going to go one way from now on. How do you deal with those pokes?
Yeah, I mean, I remember my 30th birthday and realizing like, shit, I can't be precocious anymore. It's like now I just have to actually be that. Um, and being now like, 38 years old, I guess I'm middle-aged and I don't feel like I thought I would feel when I was 21, thinking about, being almost 40. Um, and I see, I like drive past or walk past the local high school when the kids are getting let out, and I'm like, that's what high school kids look like. They're like babies. Oh my God. And you know, my knees hurt when I go on hikes sometimes, and yeah, not being able to look to the future as full of promise and possibility, but to feel like, okay, I'm basically like who I am now, and I think I'm very lucky that I found my calling, my vocation, and I feel very much aligned, and I feel very lucky to have found that, and so it makes like looking at the second half of life much easier, and more like less terrifying and upsetting, and like, oh my God, I'm almost 40 and I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing here. It's like, no, I do feel like I know what I'm supposed to be doing here. But at the same time, I'm old enough now to have experienced tragedy and to feel that human existence is tragic in many ways, and that we don't get to have everything we want, and that relationships are hard, and but it all feels worth it to me, and I do feel like even though there's not that same sense of the dream of youth as Whitehead refers to it, getting older is really interesting, and to feel how my own consciousness continues to ripen, and I gain this depth of perspective, and my whole sense of motivations, like what I find valuable to spend my time doing. It's like I never could have foreseen those sorts of shifts 15 years ago. And, I remember my younger self like looking at people who were middle-aged or older, and, like elders and stuff, and the sorts of projections I would have onto them. And as I get older and have younger people looking up to me, which is only just that sort of things just beginning. Like most of my students are still older than me. I can just see how important aging is, and that like there's just something you can't convey to an 18-year-old or a 21-year-old about the nature of life. Like there's nothing you could say that would clue them into the way that their perspective is going to shift. And you're a father, so there's that whole side of like parenting and whatnot that I hope I get to experience. But having some close friends who have gone through that and seeing how that shifts your sense of what's of value, what's important, the ability to sacrifice yourself. These are lessons that you can only learn directly through experience. And so I'm increasingly grateful for the process of aging. And yeah, there's a degree of having to let go of, you know, looking a certain way or having a certain amount of energy, or not needing to exercise as much to stay in decent shape. And so there's all that physical side of it. But the emotional maturation and the spiritual enrichment that I experience happening as a result of getting older is more than worth it.
Mm. I have to go. I want to talk for another hour and a half, but that's a great place to end it. Thank you for another wonderful Sunday conversation. Um,
Thank you, Roman. Yeah, I appreciate your questions and curiosities. Yeah, great way to spend my Sunday morning.
all right, man. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, enjoy the rest of your day.